Thank you for joining. We're just letting all the attendees in before we kick off.
Yeah, as Mike said, we'll give it about 2 minutes past and then kick off so folks can join. That's 2 minutes past. I think a good chunk of participants are in. Welcome. Let's kick off. So, welcome to our webinar on cyber recovery, how to get your important business services back online. Looking forward to the discussion today. Firstly, I'd like to introduce a guest that I have certainly learned from a lot and had a lot of great mentoring on generally in resilience and also within the topic of cyber recovery. I wonder, Mike, if you might give the audience a couple of minutes intro to yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Kai, and thanks for inviting me on. It's I'm currently the Chief Resilience and Control Officer at Santander UK. I've been meddling in this thing called operational resilience for nearly a decade now, since I took on a challenge to implement that at another organization. And I've got lots of opinions and also lots of battle scars of how to implement the regulatory framework here in the UK, as well as how to apply that into sort of lateral businesses across the globe as well. So hopefully I'll provide some helpful insights on this call, or at least perhaps tell you who to phone if you do need some more information.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm Kai Nichols, CEO, co-founder of Cutover. My background originally was in the space industry. Then I spent a long time consulting in tech and absolutely loved the human and machine collaboration at pace for critical business processes in technology, which naturally led me towards resilience, collaborating with Mike. And just to say a couple of words on Cutover. So Cutover provides automated runbooks for technology teams to really bring that human and machine orchestration together. And that can be orchestrating on-prem, cloud, or wider technology operations. And the most common use cases for cutover are failover and cyber recovery. And then after that, other processes like releasing code, patching, and migration, all that can lead towards needing to orchestrate at pace a recovery. And to do that on cutover, having the guardrails to do it quickly and not make mistakes, to reduce risk and causing errors and major incidents, and have a fantastic audit trail for compliance with the regulator afterwards. So enough about cutover for this point in the webinar. Keen to get on into the discussion. So what we're going to cover today is the fact that I think Mike and I have seen financial services across the globe adopting the Bank of England's important business services framework, whether they fall any of their operations fall within their jurisdiction. I think folks are feeding back to us that it is a useful framework for how they think about their cyber recovery. And we want to unpick that a little bit today in the discussion. We'll go through a discussion together, Mike and I, and then leave some room for Q&A at the end. So please pop the Q&A questions during the dialogue in there, and then we'll get to racing through those at the end. The learning objectives are to understand the key steps in the Bank of England's important business services framework, learn how to orchestrate your cyber recovery flexibly across your team's technology and automation, and to gain confidence and strengthen your cyber recovery posture, ensuring that your cyber recovery plans can be exercised, something that I know is a key tenet that I've learned from Mike over the years. So why don't we kick off, Mike, and if I could pick your brains initially on to give the guests a bit of an understanding of what the Bank of England important business services framework is, what does it really mean for cyber recovery?
Yeah, and I think I've said this before, but it's not often I get to share a virtual stage with a literal rocket scientist as well. So it's great to talk about this stuff. But look, the important business, if you take a step back and think about the journey the UK financial services sector has been on over the last like 11 years, really, right? We've had a couple of major events, major incidents that have had systemic impacts across the UK economy, right? Whether it's sort of short-term blips or whether it's sort of 1-2 week instances where consumers within the UK have been unable to get access to their funds, and that sort of precipitated into a much more rigorous focus on operational resilience as an end-to-end service view of how we deliver service, and then what the threats are in our inability to deliver those services. Now, I think historically, before we got there, we all looked at business activities and all about critical business activities and how we can build business continuity recovery plans for that, and all that stuff is still there. But really, when we start to pivot into an IBS or just frankly a business service, we start to think about end to end. So from our perspective, when a customer starts to interact with us to when they've completed their journey. So let's say if a customer wants to withdraw cash or check their balance on their phone or make a payment to someone else or pay their bills or use their card at the point of sale, to the point at which that money is actually, that transaction is completed. So the first thing that the framework really allowed us to do when we looked at the operational resilience regulations is start to think about what our business services were, not about the important stuff, right? Just like what is it? How does our business actually operate? And it's interesting I don't know how many other sectors are on here because I don't recognize everyone's name. So I'm sure we've got a fairly diverse cross section of businesses and sectors here. But in a lot of them, what we're hearing is that people don't know how their business actually works, which seems like a very strange thing. But if you describe it as a service view and say, well, I'm going to, from our perspective, I want to support my customers in making a card payment to buy their new shiny thing they've discovered on Cyber Monday, that's quite tangible. But actually, we weren't very good as a sector really articulating the things that needed to work to get there. So really, the first step before we even got to an IBS or an important business service, which is an unfortunate acronym, but it's before we got to an important business service, it's starting to think about how your business actually works. And then that concept of importance. So, okay, so we understand how our business works. So what does it mean to cause intolerable harm, which is a phrase you'll see in the regulations, to our customers, to ourselves, to the sector, and therefore, what are our thresholds around that? And therefore, which of these things are the most important services to us to make sure that we don't cause intolerable harm, that we are able to recover within impact tolerance? And that definition of importance is laid out quite clearly, actually, in the Bank of England website. If you do want to go and have a look at it, go and look at the operational resilience policy documents and supporting white papers as well, because it's a really nice suite of documentation that the bank has published. But from my perspective, what it's really helped us do is describe organizations and work out what's important, and then work out what things are actually required to deliver that, and then work out where do we have a risk really, right? Have we got something in that chain that if we were to suffer some disruptive event, that we would be unable to recover it within this impact tolerance that we've set? And impact tolerance is an interesting concept in its own right. And you guys could probably, those of you that are in financial services will probably sit there going, yeah, it'd be quite interested to see how they've done it, right? But with a lot of working groups we've had across the industry to really come up with some consistency on that, because ultimately it's not about risk appetite. It's not about your RTOs. It's not about your sort of minutes or hours. It's potentially days before we start to breach those thresholds of intolerable harm. So a lot of this is at that other end of the sector, at the spectrum, than some of the stuff we've been dealing with in disaster recovery planning, etc. Now, having said all that, once you've created this map of stuff, worked out what's important, worked out how you're delivering it, worked out where you have risks and vulnerabilities that mean that you may be unable to recover with impact tolerance, that's when you start to overlay scenarios. I'm kind of eventually coming back to answering the second part of your question, Kai. Right, so when you think about the scenarios that could cause a lack of availability of your important business service, it could trigger just an outage, or ultimately start to get you down the road towards breaching impact tolerance. And one of those is clearly going to be, or not one of them, but many of them will be cyber related, right? So if you think about a DDoS attack, right? So something that we all used to worry about a lot more probably a decade ago before our cyber threat actors became a lot more sophisticated and started throwing malware our way and started throwing ransomware our way. So we would have a scenario related to that. We'd have a scenario related to ransomware, scenario related to insider threat, scenario related to a whole bunch of what we would call cyber threats now, and then apply that to our important business service through structured testing and understand what is it that we need to really worry about? Where is our exposure? What can we do to protect ourselves from the outage in the first place? And through the IBS lens, recover from a disruptive event within impact tolerance. Long waffly answer, but I just gave you a little bit more background there, Kyle, kind of how we've got to where we are as a sector.
No, I think that's fantastic. And if I play that back a little, Mike, to the audience, I think you rightly said that sort of shining the light in the dark corners to work out the set of business services that you've got end to end that interact with the consumer, and they're the important components of the organization. Then you zoom in on what's an important business service that might cause intolerable harm to a consumer with those impact tolerances, and you're unpacking those important business services and seeing how people, location, and technology all support each of
data,
those.
Third parties, all the kind of sort of building blocks of how you deliver service.
And I think that when I encounter a number of folk in the industry, they all know their number of important business services. It seems that is something they can reel off very, very easily. And I think then the as you say, Mike, that's quite a sort of nest of different things that are associated with that important business service. Are there any sort of nuances that you think about that are cyber particular, to sort of unpacking that across data, recovering the technology, that folks should think about when they're looking at this through a cyber recovery lens, and trying to?
I think what's interesting is this term that we've come up with off the back of the regulations, which is a severe but plausible scenario. So when we're applying these scenarios to our important business services, we're trying to stress the scenario as much as we can, but there is a step above severe, which is extreme but plausible. So everything's plausible, but we're really focusing on remediating and mitigating the severe but plausible. Now, interestingly, when you start to think about some of these cyber attacks, so let's say ransomware, a successful ransomware that impacts all of your business systems, your endpoints, etc., within your company, locks everything up, right? That's plausible because, of course, we've seen that countless times, unfortunately. It's certainly severe. Is it extreme? Probably extreme as well, right? And I think that you will then say, well, what can I do about that? And that, I think, comes back to probably the core of where we might come back to later on in the conversations. Like, well, what can I do about it? I can't just sort of sit back and go, oh well, that's that then. I'll just get my CV ready and go and try and work somewhere else. The reality is we need to consider all of the recovery options associated with that, and the different types of threat vectors and attack vectors that you might have that are badged cyber will fall in that scale of severeness, right, as well. But what's common with all of them is that we need to run that through a scenario test, and we need to get the experts in the room to help us with it. And we stress it. It will tip into extreme at some point. Keep on stressing it, because we need answers to those questions. Because we need to reassure ourselves that we know how to recover from these types of events, or frankly, that we know that we can't recover from certain events. And we're very transparent about that and understand what that means and understand what we would do in those situations. And I'd say it's quite for business continuity professionals, operational resilience professionals, it's quite a well-trodden path to be able to do this testing, right? And to really sort of stress. I think what is different is that interconnectivity across every component that delivers a business service, because you might be focusing on one part of it before that is downstream from where your biggest exposure sits upstream in the business service. But yeah, I mean, it could be traditional like scenarios when it comes to the assets, which is the terminology we use for the components that support the business service, would be something like, I've got an obsolete bit of technology that's riddled with vulnerabilities that can be exploited by an attacker, and therefore there's a high degree of likelihood that this thing is going to fall foul to an attacker, and therefore that's going to be the foothold that sort of cascades up and down the business service, causes an outage. And so that will help us understand what protection we might want to put in place on that obsolete bit of technology in the interim while we try and work out how we can replace it with something that's more modern. Or it could be thinking about insider threat actors within your workforce and where you might have the highest likelihood of that. It could be a disgruntled employee group based on layoffs. It could be an area that's perhaps struggling a little bit more geopolitically, maybe more susceptible to influence. Those sorts of things you might want to consider as well. And that, again, comes into a cyber threat angle in most organizations, even though the reality is it's human-based, but it's humans that can be influenced by threat actors as well to exfiltrate information. So there's a whole bunch of things that you will find when you start to sharpen your attention on specific scenarios on those assets that deliver the business service.
And you may say, Mike, this is a naive question, and many of the audience may already be on this, but it does seem that through digging into these sorts of things, we're moving beyond the sort of period of time when folks would say, don't worry, I've got these preventative measures, to saying, oh no, this is how I'd actually recover. And I'm thinking in a structured way about how I'd actually do that across the scenarios that you're thinking about.
Yeah, because I think what we may have said in the past, right, is, oh, don't worry, I've got a backup of that thing that's failed, so I can recover and it'll be fine. And then you say, well, what if the backup doesn't work? You're like, oh, it's okay. I've got disaster recovery as well, so I can recover from that if that doesn't work. It's like, oh, what if that doesn't work? And in the past, we may have thought that that was implausible, right? Implausible that our two layers of protection may have failed. But actually, that's exactly what an effective cyber threat actor would do, right? Because that's how I would attack an organization. So, they're much smarter than me, right? And they have a lot more time to focus in on some of this IT. So that is now a plausible threat vector. So then you go, okay, well, now what do I do? And that's where you get a lot more creative, I think, than we have been in the past. Now, I don't think that we've obviously got to find that balance. We can't just go, well, that didn't work either. What happened? Well, there was an asteroid. So the asteroid hit. Okay, now I have. Well, then the aliens came in. You've got to draw the line somewhere in terms of plausibility, right? But ultimately, as you start to peel things away, so you haven't got that option anymore. That opens up some more lateral options to come and present themselves. And that's what the regulators are really encouraging us to do, is to look at different ways of recovering and sustaining service than maybe the historic view of business continuity and disaster recovery would have done.
I think you're right. And I think whereas some of the previous scenarios we did discussed around more traditional disaster recovery, the hurricane or the flood didn't have it in for us in a malevolent way. But in this case, you have an intelligent series of actors that can lead to additional complexity, and the plausibility of some of those things then gets sort of ratcheted up. But maybe I could pick back up on the point you made earlier, Mike, which was sort of the how. This framework is very interesting. It allows people to think in a structured way about how they would recover. What are the best practices you've had for implementing it? Because I know you've done it a number of times and are very experienced in that.
So, I think what I would say is there's no silver bullet off-the-shelf solution to help any organization protect themselves from a cyber attack, right? So every sort of way that you might want to protect yourself will be unique and bespoke to your organization, depending on the vulnerabilities you may have. But there is some commonality, right? Which is practice, rehearse, practice, rehearse, practice, rehearse. And so once you've identified the most likely threats, and perhaps some of the less likely, but still plausible threats and scenarios, rehearse it. Make sure your organization knows what to do. And it may, even you have a playbook that simply says, call the boss, call the regulators, call the police, call whatever, something as simple as that, right, is better than having a blank piece of paper where you don't know where to begin your recovery. So in a business continuity recovery plan, we would have that documented, then we have sort of steps in it. But I think what we've got now is a much broader set of stakeholders, a broader set of steps that we need to include in that. So as long as you sort of say, well, look, something bad has happened, right? This scenario has happened. Let's say it's ransomware. So you're going to spin off a whole bunch of different things. you're going to spin off a technical recovery work stream, you're going to spin off a comms work stream, you're going to spin off a legal and perhaps a legally privileged work stream and an engagement in law enforcement. You're going to make sure you keep your senior stakeholders and your board informed, and you're going to work out how you communicate with your customers and regulators and other interested parties, including press, etc., because this is going to at some point probably become public. So that's could be absolute chaos if you haven't done, at the very least, written down what your approach is for dealing with these types of scenarios. And by the way, a cyber scenario, something like a ransomware scenario, data loss scenario could be an IT triggered event for a bug or a defect or a mistake someone may make, as much as it could be a malicious threat actor that's decided to cause a smoke screen, exfiltrate data, or put a ransom in place, whatever it may be. So some of the documentation we're talking about is the same for any sort of scenario you need to have, which is that structured approach to recovery. But once you've done that, you need to build that muscle memory in the organization. Build the muscle memory, make sure you're exercising them time and time again so that everyone knows what their job is, and everyone knows that once the alarm bell rings, that they're on that call and that they have their role to do, they have their job to do, and it's rehearsed. But the other thing that, perhaps from experience as well, is that if you store all that data on your intranet, the chances are in some of these scenarios that doesn't exist anymore, right? We had an incident a couple of years ago that made the press, and we had issues for the first couple of hours actually getting into our intranet, right? And so luckily, our recovery tools were not hosted inside our perimeter; they were hosted out in the cloud. So we were able to actually get into a lot of the information we needed to get into to be able to start our recovery process and get our calls set up. But I think it's a very simple thing, right? None of this is rocket science, unlike your previous job, right? This is basically doing the basics really, really well, but starting to cast your net wider on those basics than perhaps would have been done in the past, and making sure you have a broader stakeholder map in there, and you're able to mobilize that recovery much more quickly, and you have access to the tools you need to have access when you need them.
One thing I've always particularly loved about how you've rehearsed things like this is, yes, the technology components, data, third parties and others, but you have also taken humans out of the process in the recovery. So it might be that, Fred or Fiona is an expert on these servers, or how you recover this this thing.
Yeah.
But today, Fred and Fiona aren't here, and through rehearsal and things like that, I think you build excellent muscle, because it's not only technology that can be out in these situations; it definitely also can be people that cannot get to where you want them to be.
In our last scenario, I got knocked off my motorcycle halfway through, virtually. Obviously, I didn't really, right? And so it's throwing some of those into it as well to bring it to life. We did. At previous organization, we really pioneered wargaming as an approach to exercising as well. So we're really testing to destruction, right? The scenario, and we have our red team in there pushing it. And I know a lot of other organizations are getting really good at that as well, which is good. But that's the best way of really pushing a lot of this stuff out is test it to destruction. Really make people sweat. They'll remember that. Don't sit in a room for an hour with a page turning like PowerPoint deck. Now, if you turn to page 47, you can see that now there's something has happened, and then we'll page 48, something else. Yeah, it's got to be an engaged, proper walkthrough, proper exercise.
That's great, Mike. I wonder, got some further questions around the framework and its use, but I wondered if you could maybe summarize at this stage for guests what you would think are the benefits of adopting it for thinking about things in the world of cyber recovery.
Well, again, I'm going to talk more generically. Cyber recovery is one of the key threats and scenarios, but generally taking it back to the important business service framework. Now that the operational resilience framework and policy has been born out of regulations in the UK, as I said before, and in financial services, but it's transferable to any sector at the end of the day. It's just a very basic concept, like know your business. And there was a really interesting paper that Cranfield School of Management plus Deloitte worked together on called Resilience Reimagined. If you just Google Resilience Reimagined, space Deloitte or Cranfield, you'll find the paper. And that talks much more generically about the resilience principles and how you can apply that to your organization, which includes thinking about business services and working out how your business actually operates. But from my perspective, that is the core, is understanding how your business works, understanding where your hotspots are in those end-to-end business processes that are where your key kind of risk points are and the focal points for your mitigating actions. And when you overlay that with a cyber threat lens, there's perhaps a different. In my head, I've suddenly got this, like where you the 3D glasses where you kind of put it over different colors and different colors would come through, etc. It's sort of thing you sort of put your 3D glasses for cyber over it, and you'll see like these red hot spots on your business process. If you put your 3D glasses for flooding, you'll see different hotspots, right? And once you look at those hotspots, and you think, well, how am I going to mitigate that risk? How am I going to recover if that threat actually manifests itself successfully as an outage and a disruptive event to my business service? And once you have all that, then you can start to think about, what am I going to do about it, right? And what I'm going to do about it is going to be a combination of fix the thing and work out our recovery process and our recovery steps that we're going to need to go through if that thing happens.
No, that makes a ton of good sense, as usual, Mike. And I think that what you said earlier in terms of the Bank of England, I certainly have got experience of talking about regulators in other jurisdictions that are talking about this framework. And know that, as I said, that they know their number of important business services, even though the jurisdiction isn't necessarily always related to the Bank of England.
Yeah.
It certainly seems to have gone international. But I wondered, do you think beyond financial service entities, it's also an applicable framework to help any large enterprise?
Absolutely. I mean, there are obviously some things when you think about some of the nuances of UK regulations when we start focusing on vulnerable customers, customers in financial difficulty, customers that are victims of fraud, for example. That may be something which is unique to our sector now, or more unique than other sectors that are out there. But ultimately making sure you have a sustainable company and a sustainable business, and that your customers get what they want and have paid for and deserve as part of the engagement you have with them. And that if you're sitting in a core part of a supply chain somewhere, or an ecosystem of things, and you're a big part of that ecosystem, that you maintain your obligation within that ecosystem by being available and being able to deliver your services end to end. That's ultimately what the regulations have said, but they're specific for financial services. But if you play it through that and just take sort of some of the stuff that's very unique out and just say, I'm really important in this sector because I'm supporting the back end of hundreds of other companies, or I've got thousands of customers that are expecting me to deliver my product on time and at this on time and at the right price, or if I don't do this, I'm going to be hit with a £300 million fine, loss, etc. And I don't know if my business can sustain that. That's exactly the same thing that we're doing. So the process and the methodology is completely transferable to other sectors and other industries. And I know I had a conference that Deloitte hosted where we had a lot of people from across different sectors and different industries, whether it was aerospace, travel, rail companies, government agencies, energy companies, etc. And actually a lot of them, I think, were quite grateful to, or jealous is probably the better word, of financial services for having regulations that say thou must, because it sort of encouraged best practice. Whereas I think in reality, we can all do the right thing by just thinking about how our business works. And then you can start thinking about whether or not, in addition to just being the right thing to have a resilient business, does that help you thrive through a disruptive event rather than just surviving, right? Can you thrive and flourish through disruption rather than just surviving as well? And that's where you start to see this convergence of operational resilience into organizational resilience and strategy, just general strategy of how you run your business. And if you think about that at the top of the house, that some big disruptions happened, I need to make sure my customers are safe. I need to make sure my colleagues are safe. I need to make sure our money is safe. I need to make sure I meet obligations. But how else can I help that actually might also increase some of the other positive outcomes for us in the sector? And that thinking is way away from where we were probably as a sector sort of 20 years ago, but it is where we are now. And I think it's where everyone will hopefully get to once they think about that, and realizing the interconnectivity between all the elements of service. And I will say that DORA in European legislation is really interesting now, because the UK were really first out the blocks in terms of operational resilience regulations. Europe, I mean, all geographies are lining up, which is great. Europe's DORA Act, because law, is really interesting, and it puts a much brighter light on some of our dependencies we have on technology third-party providers as well, which we're all dependent on. Big cloud providers, we're all dependent on those as well.
That tees up where I was thinking about for the next question. I think, as you say, the applicability, the attacks certainly seem to come thick and fast without care for sector. So I think, as you say, Mike, the applicability of doing something to respond seems good. So just picking up on that for the dependency on things like large cloud providers, that there can be a thought that offers me resilience, an avenue for cyber recovery. But how do you think about that in terms of the framework? Is it that different between what technology runs on-prem and what technology runs in the cloud?
Well, I think if you take your on-prem app and somehow manage to copy and paste it unmolested into a public or private cloud, like AWS or Azure, Google, Oracle, other cloud providers exist, etc. They it won't work. You won't achieve any sort of upside. You probably just get downside. I think what public cloud. So I'll just use AWS as an example. I think what AWS, if you design to take advantage of everything that AWS gives you, you can build a very highly available platform and technology service in the cloud. And if you think about, but it doesn't just come by magic. You don't just get a magic wand and just sort of, I'm on AWS. I've now got my resilience badge and I'm all good. Right? You still have to be thoughtful about how you implement that, and thoughtful about cybersecurity in the cloud as much as you would do on-prem. In some cases, a little bit more, because you're now looking at something that is, from a I guess from a perception perspective, is sat out there in the public cloud with all these attackers just sort of standing outside a fence, poking holes through the fence, whereas before they were behind a big concrete wall. You could contain that. Now it's obviously not like that at all, but that's the perception, right? So I think the understanding of what your application functionality is and how that is able to be resilient and highly available with any cloud service provider is a different skill set to perhaps what we've had in-house, when we'd be able to contain everything ourselves, and we'd be able to say, we've got our own data centers, they got big thick brick walls, they got 2 of everything, I'm going to buy the biggest shiniest servers with the bluest LEDs that I've got, because they're the ones that never fail, because they're non-stop and they never fail, and I can put whatever application code I want to put in it and it's all fine, and my job here is done. Well done me. And that won't work in public cloud, but you can actually build it to be much more, I think, resilient and available in public cloud if you actually apply the principles and what the framework gives you. But again, it's the same threats that you would get in public cloud that you get in your own environment in terms of cyber threats. So you still have to be careful, right? You still have to evaluate the risks that you have in there, think about how that manifests itself in an important business service. And in many cases, you may have had, for a risk lens, all of a sudden your IT risk of your in-house stuff is now presenting itself through a third-party risk, which again is probably the spotlight of risk is moving a lot into third-party risk for most sectors across the board as well. But you still need to think about how you prepare yourself for it. Nothing really changes in that respect. I know I sound like a broken record in that respect, but it's true. Some of it does not change. You need to be prepared. You think about your risks. You need to think about how you mitigate them and you recover from them.
I think absolutely right, Mike. I think, as you say, you can resiliently host and re-architect your applications in fantastic ways. It will cost, and it will be based on a cost benefit and resilience category, probably prioritized according to what pieces of technology support what parts of an important business service, to do that. And I see the cloud providers competing on how many data centers per availability zone and how far apart these things are to avoid some of these things. I think the general direction is good, but as you say, you've got to you can't delegate or outsource your resilience posture. It will come back to you, and so you've got to own it. So that makes complete sense.
Yeah.
So that was, go ahead.
Well, I've just got your last thing you say, you can't outsource your resilience posture. Well, you can, right? But but you have to manage that contract effectively to understand that what you're expecting from that third party is what they're delivering. So it was just a little nuance in that last comment.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get that. Make and protect.
Mm,
That's good. But yeah, in terms of also how some folks think about automation and other tooling that they would use for doing cyber recoveries, and the need to have the human in the loop. Do you have any thoughts on how you sort of bring alive some of these recovery plans,
yeah, yeah,
considering human automation?
yeah. Look, I think automation. Once you've decided what you need to do, automation can help your recovery and obviously speed things up. So I don't think anyone would disagree with that. The challenge is that there's a nuance, particularly in cyber recovery, about what it is you actually need to do. And that involves humans making decisions. And as humans, we're really bad at knowing when it's our turn to make decisions and when we need to get involved, etc., etc. Now, part of that, my sort of soapbox a few minutes ago about making sure you sort of rehearse, plan, test, etc., right, over and over again, is to build that muscle memory so people don't need to be reminded at the point of a crisis that's their job. You know, they're now on the hook for making decisions, etc., and going to collaboration. But having the ability to orchestrate humans is phenomenal, because that's what we want. Is like I say, okay, now Mike needs to come online because he needs to basically give me some information on what the current cyber threat is in the environment. How likelihood is it that we've been targeted specifically? Are we caught up in a third party issue? Are we caught up in collateral damage or something more broader? We need to know that. And then someone else needs to come in and talk about what is the actual technology solution for this event. What do we have available to us? What are the upsides and the downsides of each of those decisions? So that process of essentially orchestrating the crisis response and bringing the right people in based on the scenario that we had is absolutely critical. And none of that has got anything to do with automating recovery of technologies. We may have automation of notification off the back of it, so something like an Everbridge type tool, but doesn't tell. There's no decisions that are automated as part of that through a technology perspective. Whereas the humans, orchestrating the human part, which is orchestrating the necessity for discussion and orchestrating the outcome of that, recording the evidence that we actually of what we made and the decisions we made and why we made it, which then may trigger an automated response in terms of recovery, depending on the nature of the scenario, is absolutely critical. But so all the crises that I've had the pleasure, the right word, of chairing responses for, frankly, there are very few of them where we actually invoked any automated technology. There was a masses of them where we orchestrated a bunch of people doing stuff that was unique and specific to that scenario. And so as much of that as you can write down and orchestrate, including the engagement of those teams and records associated with them doing stuff, really helps accelerate recovery. And it also helps on our post-incident review or post-recovery reviews, and just say, well, what do we do well? What do we do badly? Do we have the right evidence? Do we have the right decisions? Where can we speed things up, etc.?
That makes a ton of sense, Mike. And maybe I just say to the audience at this point, we'll shortly move into Q&A for a brief period. If people want to raise things in the Q&A section, please do. As I discussed this last question on the agenda with Mike, and if I set go, so please do that. So in terms of one final question on the normal agenda, Mike, across the various organizations that you've been involved in your significant career, what would you say is the sort of technology stack for cyber recovery in the context of operational resilience, the different components you'd want to manage that human and machine way of recovering in the best fashion? If we've talked to date about the sort of processes and the involving and setting out the right framework, what do you see in the technology stack from your significant experience across many organizations is important?
I guess until Butlersoft invents the all singing or dancing one-stop shop for operational resilience technology, the reality is there isn't Yeah, which is not going to happen. So the reality is there is no single product on the market that solves everything resilience, which I guess is a good thing for folks like you, Kai, with Cutover, because there's a part to play for all of these different parts of the puzzle. So if you think about what the framework says, the framework says what you're going to write down what your business processes are. Now, back in the day, we have all these BPM tools, and we still use them today, which sort of tell us what our process maps are and our flows from front to back. And different organizations have that documented in different ways. Some of it might be sat in Visio, PowerPoint, Excel. It might be in a proper BPM tool that's exposed out, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully it is. Let's say it is, right? So it's your BPM tool. You wouldn't necessarily want to store your process map and your process flow in something like, I don't know, I'm going to say terrible. I won't say any product names not to use, but I mean, you wouldn't naturally think that my BCM tool is the right place for me to store my process map. You probably think from an ops perspective, a business perspective, about other tools that I've used to be able to capture that. And you should probably keep using that because that works really well as that. But what you do need to do is to think, well, how do I now overlay and wrap it in a way that it exposes the importance of that business process and records that identifies the mapping of assets that wouldn't naturally be mapped into a BPM tool. So how do I aggregate, let's say ServiceNow, if your CMDB is sat in ServiceNow, how do you bring ServiceNow in and say, well, I'm really happy with ServiceNow as my CMDB because it drives my IT service management processes, so I don't really want to use anything else. So that's okay. So you've got ServiceNow in there as well as your BPM tool. And you think, well, how do I wrap around runbooks, playbooks, etc., and scenario testing for all these scenarios I've just come up with, which are really scary but plausible, right? You know, I might use Cutover to sort of sit around that, and that needs to hook into all those tools as well to make sure that we're not double keying sort of other stuff in that randomly doesn't tell us what we're doing. You've got to have another tool that's generally managing your third-party suppliers, and you want a record in that tool that says, do I have my appropriate contractual obligations set in the contracts of those, and do I have the evidence associated with it that they've done it? I want to have my control testing on my all my control SOX and otherwise that says, is this control that's designed to mitigate risk of this specific scenario on this specific object effective or not? You wouldn't have all of that in one big tool. I mean, I know over time we might find that something like ServiceNow has these plugins and platforms and other tools that start to aggregate a lot of this stuff together, which is great. But at the moment, there isn't one product that will do all of that, or not all of that well. And so I think at the moment it is a good mix of different products that you'd have to pick out the market and think about how your organization, where it's got maturity, and if it's got maturity in certain areas, brilliant, double down on that, because I wouldn't necessarily reinvent that, but think about how you can wrap it with other elements as well.
That's great, Mike. If I now transition to some of the questions raised by the audience,
Sure.
First up is, do you think regulators have helped or hindered operational resilience?
That's a great question. I mean, I think you probably tell, hopefully, that I think that helped is the answer for this one, because one thing that, like, in every sector that we've been missing, if you think about ITIL from an IT service management perspective, a lot of what that gave us was a common language and a common taxonomy. And certainly in the UK financial services, when the regulations came out, it gave us that common language and taxonomy. It brought with it some complexity because we had to sort of work out what some of it meant. And the good news was I would say there was more of a partnership between the regulators and financial services, BC and OpRes teams, to be able to come up with some of the definitions together that made sense. Obviously, the regulations are the regulations, and we will adhere to them. But I feel that from a regulatory policy perspective, it was very much a joint effort where we felt that as a sector we wanted to be resilient, and so some of the taxonomy and language, we sort of drove that consistency ourselves. But having that consistency and that need and that obligation to demonstrate that we are resilient and represent it to our regulators on a regular basis. And at the moment, we've got a clear target of March 2025 to have remediated our material vulnerabilities that could cause us to breach impact tolerance if we suffered a disruptive event. That really helped sharpen the focus and the attention of the organization. So yes, helped.
That's good stuff, Mike. I think another one is a bit of a thorny one, about how do you consider cyber recovery from a data integrity perspective? It seems that sort of recovering the applications is easier if there are sort of several that support the same business service, and got of sort of syncing those things up and considering data loss. Bit of a trick, just give you your perspective on this one.
So I think I think if I play back the question, I think what we're saying is across a service chain for a business service, how do you maintain referential integrity of all the data in that chain when you're recovering maybe part or all of the data repositories in that service chain? So I think that's quite hard, right? Because I think we're all sitting there going, oh, that's quite hard, and it is because the reality is that we could probably we can go back to a point in time across that service chain where we say we know there's referential integrity at this point in time across all of these critical platforms, and we recover to that point. The problem is that in many cases that could be yesterday, right? Not today, right? And I need to get back to 2 hours ago, not yesterday at 1 o'clock in the morning. And I think that's the big challenge for us as a sector, was as we mature our understanding and start to think really hard about how we get to as close as real-time recovery as possible. But also, if you think about why are you recovering? So are you recovering because you've had a technology outage on one of your components? And if you have, then maybe that's auto synced out to DR, and so you've got something which is relatively current, and so you've got a little bit of recovery to be able to maintain that referential integrity across the stack. Or do you have a threat actor that's been inside your systems for don't know how long, who's been manipulating some of your core books and records data? And that's a really interesting challenge. Because you say, well, I don't know when the last known good point was in that data to maintain that referential integrity across the service chain. So the focus probably becomes a lot more on just how do we fix forward and maintaining our business processes, and then set up more controls up and downstream to allow us to detect the implications of a data integrity issue coming out the other end. So it's probably a real cerebral challenge as you start to get closer to real-time recovery across multiple systems in the chain. This is where CyberVault. I see we've got a question here on CyberVault as well, right? So does Cyber Recovery Vault solve all your problems, right? I did a vlog a couple of years ago. I think I was quite skeptical about the ability of CyberVault to solve all problems, right? It's a silver bullet solution to cyber threat, but that's because I think people were at that point didn't really understand what the use cases could be for CyberVault. And in reality, if you put all your data into it at a point in time, yeah, it's there. You know it's good for that point in time, and that's great, but that may not get you back to business, or you may have to accept that you've lost data and there's a recovery strategy you're gonna have to wrap around that. Or you might say, do you know what, I know that in this certain scenario, I'm gonna lose everything. So I'm going to have all my desktop builds, all my GitHub, everything is going to be sat in the vault, so I can rebuild my organization's technology stack if that were to happen to me. And then I'll deal with the data separately, and we'll just have to fix forward from there. But I got a plan, which how to do that, etc. So I do think data integrity across the service chain is still maturing in most organizations to think about that close to real-time recovery. Whereas, I think we're pretty good at knowing how to recover to a point in time, but that point in time naturally will involve some sort of data loss in our current solutions.
And do you think, thanks for answering the other question as well in that Mike, and do you think that in that situation, I realize testing is tricky to do it maybe for all of an important business service, for what it would require, and so duplicating environments, but do you think again that testing some of this component in terms of data integrity, what would happen, what would it really be like, is from your earlier comments, I think that also really helps here?
I mean, I think exercising with smart people in the room and the data owners is going to help, is going to give you a lot of insight without you having to actually do anything technically. Recovering a whole service chain, the data involved in the whole service chain is going to be necessary to give you the absolute confidence. And it will also probably highlight the risks and the skepticism, I think, that many of us will have on our ability to do that at a point of time which is close to real time. So you can definitely do it, but I think the reality is that going back to just saying let's get smart people, go through the data, look at the relationship, look at the data elements, think about our recovery challenges and our recovery strategies associated with that will give you an awful lot without having to do it in anger.
That makes a ton of good sense, Mike. I think that rounds us out for the question that we had in front of us. Really, really thankful for taking time with us, Mike, today. That some stellar insights. From my perspective, just summing up, hopefully folks in the audience got a good understanding of the steps involved in the Bank of England's important business service framework, the benefits of adopting that for cyber recovery, learning how to the best practices of that, the benefits of it, how to implement it and consider it for recovering across various bits of technology, how to consider automation, people, data, third parties in it, and to really hopefully gain confidence and strengthen your cyber recovery posture. And with the key tenet that Mike's pitched in this, which is the ability to sort of test, rehearse, and learn from it, which again I learn every time I get a chance to speak to Mike. So hopefully that's a decent summary of that. I don't know if Mike, you've got any final comments before we conclude.
Yeah, I would just say, look, if anyone's interested in more around the regulatory framework, go on, as I said before, go onto the Bank of England website, search for operational resilience, take you to the page. There is a little microsite on there. It has the policy statement, which is quite verbose, but it has a lot of really interesting information talking about the building blocks of the framework, including important business services and how that relates to some of the other concepts at the Bank of England that we have to adopt and adhere to within financial services. And if you look at that Resilience Reimagined paper that Deloitte and Cranfield co-wrote, it's a really interesting paper to sort of bring it home that can be applied to any industry at any scale as well.
Great stuff. Thanks, Mike. Thanks to you all. We'll conclude there, give you a few minutes back in your diary. But again, thanks, Mike, for taking time. I really enjoyed the opportunity to chat to you today.
Thank you.